I already agree with, so it's brilliant. You're just brilliant. The first question I'd like to ask actually starts with a quote. Albert Einstein said, "If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask." For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now, I couldn't solve the problem in less than 5 minutes, but you made a comment yesterday about the importance of knowing how to ask the right question.
Yeah.
And how both students need to be taught that, but first, of course, teachers need to be trained to do that. Could you please comment on that? So my question is, how does one go about learning the right question to ask?
I wish I knew the answer to that question.
Well, you can always answer with a question.
This is true. I genuinely think questioning is something that we need to understand better, as a profession, but also, just as a human endeavour, because it is so important to be able to know how to ask the right question. And yes, there's lots written about very basics of questioning. We all know the simple stuff. Don't ask closed questions. Make sure if you pose a question, you leave enough time for people to think about an answer, all of those kinds of things. But it's very tempting sometimes when you see a learner struggle to kind of step in with the answer. And I know it's one of the things that parents struggle with. When I've been a governor of a primary school, and we've had parents who really want help in knowing how to support their kids as early readers, for example, and being able to stand back and give them space when they come across a word they don't know. The temptation is always to step in and tell them what it is, instead of asking the kind of questions that might help them work that out for themselves. And I think that's the thing. In a given moment, what's the question that's going to help you think a bit harder and perhaps in a bit more focused way about the answer to a given problem? And that means you have to really understand the problem. And this is why my point that this idea that you don't need to know anything, or you don't need to know everything to be able to teach. Of course you don't need to know everything, but you do need to have a pretty good grasp of the big ideas about what you're teaching. And this idea that you can teach when you're not really very well prepared in a subject, I think is quite dangerous. And I think perhaps a cynical view is that when we've been short of well-trained people to teach, a slightly cynical view is to say, well, that's fine because you don't really need to know the stuff, you just need to be a good teacher. I think it's very difficult to be a good teacher when you don't really know your stuff. And we need to spend more time and effort in supporting people to keep their own knowledge up to date as well. And we know that teachers get a lot of satisfaction from that. But if you don't really understand your topic and you don't understand the big ideas, then I think it's very difficult to ask the right questions.
Which will lead me to my second question, and that is, for me, a huge part of what is lacking at this moment is teacher professional development time. And resources too, but time. There's just this sense that teachers need to be in front of the classroom working as if that's the only work they do. When as a teacher, we all know that most of the work occurs outside of the classroom. Classroom is showtime in a way, or at least organizationally speaking. But outside the classroom is when so much work gets done that people never see. How do we go about fixing that problem?
Well, I think some of the possible answers to that are quite controversial. So if you look at the one interpretation that Andreas Schleicher makes of some of the OECD data is that if you look at where you get the best bang for your buck with your investment in education, actually the more you spend on teacher development, the more impact you have on the overall outcome. So one of the possible interpretations, and I realise this is extremely controversial, so I'm not advocating it, but I think it's something we should explore. For example, are you better having fewer contact hours and more teacher development time? We've tended to go for a rather long hours culture in the UK. We keep kids in class for a long time. If you compare it with, say, Finland, and unfortunately France has actually just changed their mind about this. They've now put Wednesday afternoons back into class time, I understand, rather than more recreational time. But in Finland, there is more time even within the school day for what we would call play. And we don't do that very much in the UK anymore. Kids are there and they're being taught the whole time. Maybe that's not the right answer. You know, maybe less higher quality taught time is the answer. Another possible formulation, and again, there's a lot of controversy around class size and the importance of class size, because most of us who've ever taught, I think, feel that just instinctively smaller classes must be better. But actually, being in a larger class with a better prepared teacher is better than being in a smaller class with a less well-prepared teacher. So maybe some of it is about allowing for slightly larger class sizes, so less contact hours, more professional development time for teachers. I mean, there is no one right answer, okay? But there are things that need to be explored. And simply saying that the key variable is how long you're in front of those kids teaching them is maybe not the right answer.
There was one thing you said that really resonated with my view of what's going wrong with how teachers treat students, is that you said we stopped educating teachers, now we train them. And well, coincidentally, you're in China, and it seems like it's a common ground that we enforce rote learning on teachers so that they have no other way but to enforce rote learning on students again as well. So my question is, what's one most important key thing you find that has to be changed in order to veer away from the rote learning on teachers?
Well, I think theory of education has a very bad press. There is this idea that these airy-fairy academics want to spend time teaching teachers education theory, and it's a waste of time. And there are people who are being asked to learn education theory who sometimes think it's a waste of time. Well, actually, if you don't have some theoretical insights into your practice, when the method that you've chosen to use doesn't work, you don't have the tool set to analyse what's actually going on in your classroom and why that particular instructional approach isn't actually working for the kids in front of you. So I strongly believe we need to understand more about theory of education when we start to teach, and we need time and space during that development in that early time in the career to make the links between what's happening in the classroom in front of us and what we understand about theory of education. And I also include in that things like more psychology, possibly some neuroscience, more understanding of the way humans learn, the way humans interact, more sociology. Those kinds of things really need to be part of a teacher's armoury, not as abstracted theoretical concepts, but actually as a tool set. Theory is a tool, so it's a tool set to help you understand and analyse what's going on in front of you. And without that tool set, I think you really struggle to understand your own practice and the effect of your own practice on learners. So it's really important, and I think that's a lot of what we've lost, that and time for reflection.
One of the tools you mentioned that is underutilized is the student-to-student interaction and how important that is. And you said that students don't value their interaction with each other. And I was thinking about that and wondering how as a teacher do you try to get them to value that? How do you encourage them to actually use that time? And part of my thought is that maybe part of the reason they don't value it is that we aren't building that interaction to the degree in which it's actually valuable. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think again, there is a lot of work around collaboration and how you teach and how you learn to collaborate. But I think the simple answer is one step at a time. So, for example, you can start with a situation where you have maybe pair work, where you ask students in pairs to look at and comment on one another's work. And becomes fairly evident quite quickly that it is quite useful when somebody points out, well, I don't really understand what you're saying here. Are you sure that's right? Why did you put that answer? So it's also about modelling that effective questioning. So a really nice example was a primary teacher who was teaching poetry and posting kids' poems in the online learning environment. This is an elementary school, and inviting the kids to put up comments about each other's poetry. But he was also modelling the kind of comments that you make in his own behaviour, and trying to get past the point where when you do that, what tends to happen first of all is kids will just say things like, oh, I like this, or that's really nice, or whatever. But then as the teacher you can go in and say, well, what did you like about that? Why did you like this one rather than that one? So it's that idea, and it comes back to questioning again, actually, and it comes back to that idea of building up more sophisticated questioning and answering, so that rather than simply saying, well, I like that because I like this element. So beginning to develop those powers of critique, which is all part of appreciation, of course, in the context of poetry. And those kinds of skill sets make you a much more valuable co-learner. You are able to critique, not criticise, but critique someone else's work in a way that is helpful. And also understanding that that's fine, that's how it is, and that's how real writers work. That's what editors are for. People don't simply write a fantastic novel and it just churns out of their word processor perfectly. They work with editors, and the really good writers will admit that and say, if I have this fantastic editor and that's why my books are so good. So that whole process of editing as an important element in the protocols of producing something is something that we can really usefully, I think, tie into the process of working at school. But we're sometimes slightly sort of hampered, I think, by the idea that, well, whose work is it then at the end? Who am I going to give the grade to? And you just have to kind of get past that, really, and recognise that it's the quality of the overall outcome that is really important in terms of understanding and developing learning, rather than just, I did this all by myself. Subtext, which is why it's not that good. When you work with other people, your work is always better.
So let's talk about standardized tests. So in your,
Do we have to?
Most countries have their own standardized tests that they give, and there's like a saying in the business world that you manage what you measure. So are standardized tests the whole problem? Because if I'm a teacher, I'm going to make sure I manage that, so I'm measured well. That has an impact on how I feel about myself, how others see me, and in some countries, perhaps on your evaluation, ultimately your salary.
Yeah.
Is that the problem?
There is a place for standardized testing, without doubt. Okay, and those kinds of comparability, they are an important check. The problem is that we've got to a situation where they are the only thing that is really valued. And the situation you've just described, where your standardized test scores ultimately determine your salary. Well, there was a really nice study published this summer from Stanford showing what an unreliable measure of teaching quality standardized testing actually is, because there are so many factors that ultimately impact on your standardized test scores that are beyond the influence of an individual teacher, that they're a very, very unreliable measure of teacher quality. So the idea that your pay would be linked to your kids' standardized test scores is a very high-risk strategy. So yeah, it's not the tests per se. It's the fact that we are putting so much weight and emphasis on them, and we need more than that. We need more than there is a place for standardized test scores, but we need more than that to really understand where the value of an educational output, and arguably where the value of an individual lies. You are more than the sum of your standardized test scores. Thank goodness.
One of the challenges I see in standardized tests, although I'm not opposing them in theory, is that it does say there is a right answer, and you have to be right. all the time. Whereas I, as a teacher, love to say failure is an iteration to future success.
Yeah.
Fail as much as you want, because without failure there is no learning.
Yeah.
So how do we incorporate the growth mindset and the idea of taking what you've learned and improving upon it as you fail to be perfect, to get better? How do you do that?
Well, firstly, so many things spring to mind. Firstly, you need to differentiate between formative and summative assessment.
Right.
So, I mean, it would be unfortunate if standardised tests were the only instrument used in a formative assessment process, because clearly you need more than that. That feedback is so important. And simply being told that you were wrong and not why you were wrong is not helpful. You also need really well-designed tests, because well-designed tests don't simply have to have right and wrong answers. There is room for extended answers. Because when you get to the point where you're using machine-marked tests, then that does tend towards the closed question. And there are examples of machine-marked open-ended questions, but they tend to be very short-answered pieces and so on. And you do need to make sure that there is, if you're going to use tests, you do need to make sure that you've got a variety of question type and there is room for the development of argument, for example, in your answers, and you do have some more extended answers. So the standardised tests need to be more than tick sheet questions to get a rounded picture. But if you simply use those kinds of tick sheets as your only formative assessment vehicle, then you really are on a bit of a hiding to nothing.
In this situation you face, the influx of almost boringly formulaic education lies the students, right? So everything we do, everything the society does to go towards a better type of education, the students are obviously the reason. So in this situation, students must be playing a part. Students must be having a responsibility on them to improve their situation as well. So to what extent do you think the students should be trying to live an inquiry-based life? So if you could say anything to the students about this, what would it be?
Oh, that's such a good question. One of the things that I think schools have to be really careful of is that they never crush a student's natural curiosity. And schools are often accused of doing this. Now, puberty does a lot to crush natural curiosity. It's not only schools. We go through that phase of discomfort and difficulty, and we just want to conform and fit in, and we don't want to be different from anybody else, and that's just a natural process of growing up. But fostering that natural curiosity is so important. And yes, everybody should lead an inquiry-based life. It's a really nice way of putting it. Always ask questions. Don't take things at face value. Don't be a sheep. If someone is trying to sell you something, whatever that is, whether it's a product or an idea or anything, you should always ask some questions and make up your own mind. And if I was to distill down the outcome of an education into one simple thing, I would really want people to understand the difference between an evidence-based opinion and a belief. It's not to say necessarily that one is better than the other, but you really should understand the difference and be able to make an informed choice about which you're going to go with. Are you making this decision with your head or your heart? And make it with one or the other, but know which you're doing and why.
So if we can change gears a tiny bit, talk about technology. You mentioned that we need good, solid, robust technology that is a delight for teachers to use.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering,
really nice experience back about a year ago, actually. I was asked to do some sessions with some teachers who were preparing to bring in the new coding curriculum in the UK in primary schools. And a lot of those teachers were very, very worried and uncomfortable about this because it was outside their experience, so understandably they were nervous about doing it. But I met some wonderful, wonderful head teachers from elementary schools who were my kind of age, they'd been around a while, and they had taught when schools used things like floor turtles. And they were so excited because they were going to be able to get their floor turtle back out again because it's a perfect thing for teaching early coding. And so, yeah, you know, things like floor turtles, programmable toys, they are just absolutely delightful. And they're that wonderful mixture that makes hard fun. You know, it's not easy to do, it's not easy to get it right, but it's really satisfying when you do. And you get that instant feedback. You know, you wanted the turtle to turn left and it's turned right. So what are you going to change now to make it do what you wanted it to do? And that fantastic instant feedback so yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful example. It's not terribly complicated. It's actually very simple, but it's a wonderful example of a delightful technology.
Kids and technology. So many people think that kids are digital natives. I call them digital naives. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Oh, I really loathe the term digital native. It's so unhelpful. It's, you know, and it also, people talk about intuitive interfaces. Well, actually, they tend to just be reliable, so that once you've learnt something once, it will still apply. But there's not anything necessarily inherently intuitive. And young people are sometimes better at those because they're more prepared to fail. You know, when you're a kid, you're not used to having mastery of the world, so you're used to screwing up. It happens to you all the time. You know, and when you're an adult, you feel you really should have a degree of mastery and you shouldn't get things wrong all the time. And so it inhibits us a bit. So there is that difference between that natural curiosity and that, you know, you're prepared to just keep going at stuff until something interesting happens. But we do need to support youngsters to make effective use of technology, and particularly to make effective technology to support their learning. And if you start from a standpoint that, oh, you're going to know how to do all of this, I don't need to show you anything, actually you do them a disservice. And well, a nice moment actually, a friend and colleague of mine had looked at the book I've just written, and she's a professor of human-computer interaction. You know, she really knows her stuff. And she said, you know, it had never occurred to me before. She said, and I went home last night, she said, and I had a completely different conversation with my son from the one I might have had before, because I was just assuming that he knew how to use these technologies. And so I showed him how to do something. And she said, you know, when she said, putting his bed, she said, Mum, she said, I'm really glad you showed me how to do that. And she said, it had just never occurred to her before that he didn't know how to do this particular thing on the computer. And that, you know, and if someone who is, and she said, I don't understand it. She said, if I was running a study in a school, then I would know that we would have to show the kids how to do this. But with my own son, I just assumed he would know how to do it. And I think that's really, really important, that we don't make that mistake of assuming mastery where it doesn't exist, because we risk undermining kids. You know, the kid I talked about who really didn't like her personal device because she said it was just one more thing she couldn't do. You know, it's really, you have to be really sensitive to that, and that assumes something. You know, actually, there's never been a 5-year-old who could program the video recorder. You know, these myths are not helpful. They're really not helpful.
I hope this makes a nice link with the term digital naive, because the thing is that as students, we're in a new century. We're living the 21st century, and the learning, as you've mentioned in your presentation, is changing. Is meant to be changing immensely with the combining of technology into education. And for parents, obviously for mine as well, it must be an overwhelming amount of changes that are taking place in their children's education. So coming from that perspective, what kind of attitude should parents be having in this new era of technological education? Where should they be coming from when they're viewing a new type of education, do you think?
Yeah, well, being a parent has never been easy. You know, people say it's the hardest job in the world, and it probably is. And I think it's perhaps particularly challenging to be a parent, particularly of a teen at the moment. It's really tough to be a teenager. You know, it's a really hard world that kids are inhabiting. And they're under an awful lot of pressure, a lot of peer pressure, a lot of expectation, really tough job market facing them. You know, it's a really tough time. But one of the things that's really, really important is that people carry on doing stuff and talking with their kids, even when your kids are at that stage where they want you to walk behind them in the street because they don't want to be seen with you. You know, you need to keep the dialogue going. And interestingly, digital games are a really good environment for doing that, because you can, and the industry woke up to this about 10 years ago and started producing more multiplayer games. Playing digital games with your kids, and yes, they will be better than you, and yes, they will beat you, but that's good, you know, and then you can talk about what you're doing. And what's a really, really not a good idea is when kids are locked away in their rooms with their technology and parents don't get engaged and don't intervene. But have those conversations, talk about the technology, get kids to show you what they're doing and tell you about it and talk about it. But you have to start doing that when they're young. You know, if you start trying to do that when they're 14, you really have made a tough road for yourself. But you've got to keep, you know, show an interest and be prepared to look stupid. You know, they're going to think you're stupid anyway, so you may as well just own up to it.
Brilliant. And as a father of an 11-year-old, we play games together, and I'm going to show this video to my wife. Thank you. Now, last question, or last point. So, get on an elevator, and some person you never met before says, I know you, I saw you in the video. You do all that ed tech stuff and all that research. We got 2 minutes. Give me your magnum opus. Put it in a nutshell. What should I walk away with? Remember.
That's such a hot question. Never let the technology make you forget that the people who are important in the interaction are the human beings. And never let the technology get between you and the other people. And I think we have to ask ourselves some really hard questions. You know, when you see people sitting in restaurants and they're not talking to one another, they're both looking at their phones, something's going wrong. And I think we're at risk of letting the technology get between us instead of helping us be more connected. So don't let the technology get between you and the rest of the real world. And don't see the whole world through the screen of your phone while you photograph it. Put away the camera sometimes and just look at the view.
Now I'm in trouble. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's okay, Mickey,
Thank
take a
you.
picture.